that this is the third semester that he is giving the presentation. All of his work is recorded on the website, and it is also, the printed part is under ISE articles. All right, Andrishka, go ahead, take it from here.
Okay, well, that was all interesting, and nice thing is, well, it's not a nice thing, but I'm assuming that that was not an accident, because I'm looking at the phone numbers, and there's an active phone number, no longer active right now, but that I think was trying to cause problems, but that is another story, to tell you the truth. Today is going to be very interesting. I think it's going to be actually one of the most important lectures of the series, because it's the fons et ergo of everything. Literally, it is the locus of everything. And there's this idea that it's a grand conspiracy theory to suggest that the purpose of this locus is to subvert and destroy Western civilization. And I'm here to tell you that it is not a conspiracy theory, and it's not a conspiracy theory to liberals as well. The only people who suggest it's a conspiracy theory, and we're talking about the Frankfurt School, are the people who are either on the radical left who know that's not the case, but wish to push forward that trope for obvious ends, or people who literally don't know what they're talking about. And this is where my specialty lies, is Frankfurt School methodology and the history of the Frankfurt School. So we're going to come to terms with what the word critical means. But we're first going to try to understand that the woke movement, the neo-Marxified ethos that is Marxified, it's done, it's been Marxified, right, is actually a mixture of two things. And we're going to be talking about those two things. The first is obviously Marxism, right? The other is postmodernism. So there are twin masters that are hovering, right? When you put those together, you can call it postmodern neo-Marxism, right? That's woke. There isn't anything else that consists of woke other than Marxism and postmodernism. So I'm going to be first talking about what Marxism is. What do they mean by Marxism? What does the word critical mean in those terms? But I have to first give everybody a primer of the Frankfurt School and what it is specifically and what it is not, in order to understand critical theory. In very layman terms, the Frankfurt School is a mass-scale intellectual response mechanism to the disasters of Western civilization that happened in the early 20th century. So you have things like the Treaty of Versailles, which ended the First World War, right? The Frankfurt School began in 1923, when the Treaty of Versailles was signed in 1918. Now it gets really interesting because the Frankfurt School, you have to understand, is a mass-scale intellectual response mechanism to the catastrophes of 19th or 20th century German politics. World War I is the first step. So the first response was to the Treaty of Versailles. Now, what was the Treaty of Versailles? The Treaty of Versailles said the war is over. But no, it did something else. What it did, and there's a part of the Treaty of Versailles that says, that's called the War Guilt Clause. And it suggests that everything, absolutely everything about World War I was Germany's fault. Everything. Everything was their fault. They were forced by the Treaty of Versailles to pay for all the reparations, to pay for all the damages, to come to terms with guilt. And so what that did, and in reality it wasn't all Germany's fault, what the Treaty of Versailles did was induce a mass-scale neurosis. It induced a international scale humiliation on Germany. And what is the problem with that is if anybody knows what Germany is the history of Western civilization. The First Reich was the Holy Roman Empire. That's Germany. The Second Reich was the Weimar Republic, and the Third Reich was Hitler, right? Those three Reichs are Western civilization. And so what that means, in essence, is if you're German, you have a German spirit. You have the spirit of Western civilization. You have a German identity, right? That identity that you have, and everybody has an identity, you know? People have an American identity. Oh, America is what, 200 years, a little over 200 years old, all big deal, right? No, if you have a German identity, your identity is the identity of history. All of great music was German, right? Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, Schubert, Schumann, Mozart, Handel, and Wagner, and I can keep it going. They're all German. The scientists, you know, you can go to, if you want to talk about quantum physics and stuff, you can go to Niels Bohr, technically Danish, but still German. Einstein, right? You can go to Pauli and like, right? All essentially German. Yeah, you have little sprinkles of other cultures in there too, but it's all essentially German. When you talk about things like philosophy, oh, you have Heidegger and you have Nietzsche and you have you can technically say Freud and you have Carl Jung and right, all German. If you have a German identity, your identity is the identity of Western civilization, is the identity of history. And what the Treaty of Versailles did, and everybody knows what I'm talking about because you would have to look at it through the theoretical lens of what if America just got wiped off the planet right now? What would that do to your identity if you're American, right? You would feel that, right? We're not talking about 200 years of history, though. We're talking about all of history, essentially. And so when you have something like the Treaty of Versailles, which explicitly said that everything was Germany's fault, which explicitly said that all of reparations have to be burned on Germany, which explicitly said that everything that needs to be fixed is at the feet of Germany. When you have something like that, what you do is you produce a mass-scale neurosis. You are assaulting the spirit of Western civilization in a lot of ways, the spirit. And so the Frankfurt School is that mechanism, is that response mechanism, right? So the Frankfurt School was a school that consisted of the smartest people ever to exist. And that is not a play on words or anything. That is actually true. The Frankfurt School intelligentsia were unbelievably intelligent people. And this German intelligentsia, this locus of intelligentsia is the response mechanism to early 20th century politics, the failure of German politics. It is that response mechanism. And you'll see that there's a linear relationship between how radical and crazy the Frankfurt School gets through time, right? So in 1923 is when it was technically founded, and it was funded by elitists. So they're elitist in two senses. They're elitist in the sense that they had a lot of money and they were on the top of almost everything, right? The Frankfurt School. But they're also elitist in the sense that they had their special language. They had a special language that nobody else was able to really understand because not only is it unbelievably complicated, but the philosophy behind the Frankfurt School is unbelievably deep. It's a special kind of Marxism, and we're going to talk about that in a second. What kind of Marxism is it? It's neo-Marxism. We'll talk about that in a second. But if you understand that the Frankfurt School is a mass-scale response mechanism to 20th century German politics, you have to view the aspirations, thoughts, and passions of German intellectuals at the time through the medium of these catastrophes. And you can call it World War I. You can eventually call it World War II, right? You can, try to look at it through that medium. Understand that these intellectuals were bred from that time. From the time Germany essentially went downhill, and from the time Germany was required, the world required them to pay for everything and to and to admit guilt to actually everything. And the Treaty of Versailles was an absolutely terrible, terrible approximation, by the way. It wasn't Germany's fault, actually, but that's an entirely different story. What you do, if you do this, is you create a school of unbelievably hyper-intelligent people who have developed a purpose, essentially, to absolutely destroy Western civilization. And it is not a conspiracy theory. And we're going to talk about, I'm going to prove all this in a bit. It is not a conspiracy theory that the Frankfurt School's purpose is to subvert Western civilization. You can go on Wikipedia and they'll tell you it's a conspiracy theory, right? I wrote an article on Wikipedia in 2019, and I titled the article Cultural Marxism. And I had a few other people co-edit and stuff like that, right? In 2021, they took it down. They took it down and replaced it with Cultural Marxism Conspiracy Theory. And so that's the last thing I ever wrote on Wikipedia because they are unbelievably ideologically bent. So the Frankfurt School began in 1923. Now, the Frankfurt School is that intellectual mass-scale response mechanism to that identity crisis, to that existential identity crisis that was experienced by the German people. And I made it clear that if you want to understand a flavor of what that is, just try to imagine, try to comprehend America for some reason being completely wiped off the planet and you were made to take harbor in some other country. You would feel that identity crisis to some extent. That's only 200 years. You have to understand this. So that's barely 200 years, right? We're talking about all of Western civilization. And there, as I said, there are three Reichs. The first Reich was the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire were all Germans, right? Now don't get that confused with the Roman Empire. That's different. So the Holy Roman Empire began with Charlemagne, right? So when the Roman Empire fell, and so you have that very long stretch of history all the way until the Weimar Republic and then the Third Reich. So Germany, in a very real sense, is the history of Western civilization. And the Treaty of Versailles was forced them to come to terms with a unbelievably burdensome amount of guilt on an international scale. Okay, so if we understand that the Frankfurt School is an intellectual response mechanism, that is the first step to understanding critical theory, which is the tool that the Frankfurt School uses to subvert and dismantle society. And that is the purpose. So this gets me to essentially, now I'm not going to get into the philosophy theory because it is unbelievably complicated and that wouldn't be the point. The point is, what does critical mean? Because that is a word that I have said needs to be taken back from the linguistic territory. There's this idea that they have seized they have seized the language, but they can't seize the dictionary, our dictionary, right? The word critical, so without getting into too much depth, Horkheimer, who was one of the founders of the school, defines critical in a book, actually it was in an essay. One of the most foundational essays, actually the most foundational essay of Frankfurt School, because it defines what critical means. And he defines what critical means in an essay called Critical and Traditional Theory, right? So there's this idea that there's critical theory and there's traditional theory. What is critical theory and traditional theory? There's traditional theory, and this is according to Horkheimer. So there isn't any other valid source in the universe to define what the word critical means, what critical theory is, other than Horkheimer, who is technically the intellectual godfather of the Frankfurt School. And this 1937 piece called Critical and Traditional Theory, he makes it explicitly clear that there is critical theory and there's traditional theory. He makes it explicitly clear that what traditional theory is epistemological defaults like reason, logic, deduction, correspondence, validity, right? That's traditional theory. And the purpose of traditional theory is to describe, right? Critical theory, the purpose is to prescribe. And he makes this dichotomy. So critical theory is prescriptive. And we're just getting started here. Critical theory means to prescribe something, right? Traditional theory means to describe something. So you have the difference between knowledge and values. You have the difference between what the Greeks called techne versus telos. So in Western civilization was fundamentally predicated on the idea that in order to know reality, reason should be held primary. Now, the idea that there's a dichotomy that Horkheimer specifically makes clear exists, that critical theory is prescriptive, what they're prescribing is a normative vision for society, a totalizing normative vision for society. And they're not describing society. The word critical is, in that sense, Marxist because, as Marxists explicitly said, the point isn't to understand society, it's to change it. That is, the point isn't to understand anything, but to transcend everything. And that's the 11th thesis on Feuerbach. That's very, very famous. The point of society isn't to understand it, but to change it. So the presuppositional default is that changing is the purpose of critical theory. Changing is the purpose of critical theory. It isn't to understand anything. The purpose of critical theory isn't to understand anything. The purpose of anything critical is not to understand anything, but to change everything. Right? Now, in 1923, when the Frankfurt School began, it wasn't as radical as you would think. And as I have said, that the amount that it does get radical there's a linear relationship between the degree in which the Frankfurt School gets radical and the degree in which politics becomes unbelievably insane. So in 1923, that's obviously before the Second World War, but it's after the First World War. The World War II obviously ended in 1945. The 1945 is the time in which the Frankfurt School was mostly insane. And I'm saying insane not in a good way, in a very bad way. And so in the 60s, you have all this radical left violence. And we're going to be talking about Herbert Marcuse. But if we understand that what critical means, according to the founders of critical theory, and there's only 4 people I'm going to be mentioning, despite there's about 20 of them that are important. But there are only about 4 that are absolutely important, actually more important than everybody else. Right? Everything else is just complicated intricacies, essentially. We have Horkheimer, who's the father. He was the father of he was the father of the Frankfurt School, and he defines what it means for something to be critical. And there's 2 instances where he defines something to be critical. In the 1937,
will you spell names,
yes,
please, when you say them?
Yes, Horkheimer is Horkheimer, and his first name was Max. So Horkheimer defines critical theory in direct opposition to traditional theory. That's very important. He did this in 1937. Now, this is when it was technically coined. The Frankfurt School began in 1923. You could be asking yourself, oh, why did it take this long to fathom what critical theory still existed in 1923? It just wasn't coined. We needed someone to coin it, and Horkheimer essentially did that in the 1937 piece called Traditional and Critical Theory. After that was published, it was set in stone what critical theory was and what its purpose was. Traditional theory is meant to describe, or is meant to be descriptive of some phenomenon, usually social, and the aim is to understand how it works and why it works, right? A critical theory should proceed from a prescriptive normative moral vision for society. Describes how the item being critiqued fails that vision. And it prescribes activism to subvert, dismantle, and disrupt the situation. It is to remake society in accordance with a particular moral vision. Marx's insistence that everything be ruthlessly criticized, right? That's a very, very famous quotation that he sent in a letter, Marx, about ruthlessly criticizing everything, right? So that's where the term critical really comes from. It begins with Marx, to tell you the truth, but Horkheimer systematized it. And he defines critical, something critical, and I'm defining one place where he talks about it in 1937, a piece called Critical and Traditional Theory. So he makes that dividing dichotomy and suggests that critical theory has nothing to do with traditional theory. It has nothing to do with the sciences. It has nothing to do with epistemological defaults. It has nothing to do with knowledge. That's not what critical theory is. And it's not what critical theory is because that's what he says. So there's no confusion as to the fact that critical theory has nothing to do with what traditional theory is. He makes that dichotomy, and that's very important. Many people will tell you critical theory is just it's a social theory, or it's a theory in you could say sociology. It's like, no, it's not. So the other place where he defines critical theory, well, I'll tell you what he suggests. The verbatim quote is, something critical is that which seeks to emancipate. So insofar as something is brought about in emancipation, that's critical. So the purpose of something critical is emancipation. And that's Horkheimer explicitly says that if it's critical, what it seeks is emancipation. Emancipation from what? So if defining critical theory is inextricably linked with emancipation, it suggests that emancipation from what? So the idea that it's a conspiracy theory that they want to subvert and destroy Western civilization. The fact that critical means emancipation, and emancipation from what, should suggest that what people need to be free from is something. And obviously it's Western civilization. There's no question about that. I mean, it's very explicit as to that too. Something is critical insofar as it seeks to liberate humanity from all that oppresses him. That's the verbatim quote right there by Horkheimer. Something is critical insofar as it seeks to liberate humanity from all that oppresses him. So it already begins with a presuppositional substrate that power dynamics is the norm, negative power dynamics. It assumes from the onstart that reality is riddled with evil, right? That there is good and evil in the material sense, and the purpose is to overcome all of it. It's deeply eschatological. So 1937 is when it's defined, critical. Critical means prescribing a normative vision for society. It means to change and not to understand. And anything critical seeks emancipation by definition. So if it's critical, the ultimate concern for something critical is emancipation. Transcendence has nothing to do with trying to understand reality, and it's explicit. Horkheimer says explicitly that in his traditional and critical theory that there are two types of theory. There's the traditional and the critical. The traditional seeks to understand reality. It seeks to control nature in some way. It seeks to understand reality and not to transcend it. Traditional theory or critical theory seeks to change reality. That is the only purpose for something critical is to change and explicitly not understand. So, and Horkheimer gets the idea, the word critical critique, not only from Immanuel Kant, but from Marx's quotation concerning a letter where he suggested that we must ruthlessly criticize all that which exists. So understand that critical doesn't mean what it means in terms of maybe like critical thinking, where what you're doing is you're in a reflective process and you're trying to understand something. Understanding is not the goal of critical theory, and that's what Horkheimer says. Horkheimer says traditional theory is about understanding things, right? So please understand that critical theory is not made to describe anything. It is not descriptive. It's prescriptive. And it prescribes a normative vision for society. Horkheimer says that. Horkheimer says that critical theory's purpose is to prescribe a normative vision. That normative vision is obviously socialist man. It's obviously sublated man. It's obviously the communist utopia. And so I mentioned that there is a linear relationship. I first mentioned that the Frankfurt School, which was founded in 1923 by these elitists, and they're elitists in two senses. They're elitists which are positive in both senses. Positive not meaning good, but positive meaning actual. The first sense that they're elitist is that they were very rich. They were not oppressed, I'll tell you that. In the second sense, they're elitist that they had the critical lens. They had a special Marxified idea of reality, and it wasn't accessible to normal people. Their language is unbelievably complicated. Critical theory is not an easy thing to understand. They understood all of it. They were also the most intelligent people in the world at the time. Okay? Now this leads me to two other people. So Horkheimer defines critical theory. That's the first step, is if you want to understand critical theory, or what critical theory means, what the word critical means, you go to Horkheimer. You don't go to Wikipedia. You don't go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, although the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy will tell you the same thing I am. You go to Horkheimer. Okay, so understanding critical means to transcend. It means to overcome the apparent negative oppressive dynamics of society. It means to understand nothing and to transcend everything. That's the first step. The second step is to understand what critical theory is in application. And the answer to that is neo-Marxism. Now, I mentioned this many times before, but it's good to recap because there may be new people. There are two other people we're going to be talking about just now. There was Horkheimer, and I said there's going to be four people in terms of understanding critical theory. We're going to get to postmodernism in a second. The two people are Georg Lukács and Antonio Gramsci. Now, what these two people effectively did, single-handedly, I might add, is, well, first of all, I'll tell you why they did it. They saw that Marxism wasn't working for some reason, right? These are the first intellectuals, and they were unbelievably intelligent. The idea that these guys were evil or stupid is actually false. They were unbelievably intelligent, unbelievably read. So there's these two people, Antonio Gramsci and Georg Lukács, and they effectively produced a paradigm shift. And this paradigm shift, so before I get to the paradigm shift really quick, I'll tell you why. These two people, like nobody else, saw that Marxism wasn't working. And it wasn't working at all. Like it wasn't working at all. Nothing about Marxism was working. And the reason why they came to the conclusion that the reason why it wasn't working is because Marxism wasn't anything economic. Marxism had nothing to do with economics. So you're trying to instantiate something that is, I might add, unbelievably religious and dogmatic onto something as material as economics and class, right? You can call this traditional Marxism. Traditional Marxism dealt with two categories, economic and class. Economics and class are rigid categories. You can't reinterpret economics and class on the whim. They're objective metrics. right? That's why Marxism did not work, according to Gary Lukács and Antonio Gramsci. It didn't work because the domain of analysis, which were economics and class, were too rigid. And when you have something like dogmatic religion, what you have is something that cannot stand on its predictions, right? Because there's no correspondence. So what they did, essentially, is they shifted the domain of analysis away from those two categories, away from those objective categories, and they instantiated it onto culture and identity, right? You can call it identity Marxism, you can call it cultural Marxism. The term is neo-Marxism. So when people talk to you about what was the Frankfurt School, and trust me, I've not gone into any details at all. You can tell them that the Frankfurt School is neo-Marxism. What is critical theory? You can tell them that critical theory is neo-Marxism. Now, Antonio Gramsci and Gary Lukács are two more godfathers of the Frankfurt School. And it is the historical consensus among scholars that Gary Lukács himself was the greatest Marxist scholar ever to live. And he understood Marx like nobody else could have ever understood him. And he understood him without the economic and class bits, right? So there's a famous quote by Leszek Kolakowski, who was another giant in terms of understanding Marxism. And he said basically that Das Kapital, which is one of the fundamental texts of Marx in terms of page count and stuff, was just it was metaphysics dressed up in economic language. So you have things like the word class consciousness, right? Class consciousness kind of sounds like economics, right? It's not. Nope. It's straight up Gnosticism, and it's the idea. Class consciousness is the idea that if you can have special access to reality, have special insight into reality that isn't arrived at through epistemological defaults like reason, logic, deduction, correspondence, validity, right? That's another story. But all these terms you see in that come from Das Kapital. If you read Das Kapital, it looks like an economic treatise. It's not. And the first person to realize this was Gary Lukács. And then everybody after Gary Lukács literally came to terms with the facts that Marxism isn't anything economic at all. It's a special kind of worldview that involves the theory of man in the universe. It is not at all scientific. It is not at all economic. It is not at all social. And Gary Lukács was the first person to actually understand this on a degree that no other person could have ever done so. And Antonio Gramsci was the second part of that process in terms of output. So remember, those two people, Antonio Gramsci and Gary Lukács, fundamentally shifted the domain of analysis away from economics and class and into identity and culture. And cultural Marxism, or you can call it identity Marxism, neo-Marxism as a term, was born. Right? So we're talking about the Frankfurt School and what has happened. Okay? The last person to mention, and there are more people, but these are the most important people. And this is where the Frankfurt School went literally insane. And frankly evil. Okay? So, and to understand this process, this was Herbert Marcuse. Okay? So, Herbert Marcuse was the father of the second generation of the Frankfurt School. So you have the first generation, which consisted of Horkheimer and Adorno and Gary Lukács and Antonio Gramsci, right? When that phase kind of ended, when that phase of, we have shifted the domain of Marxist analysis away from economic and class, where it never really was meant to belong in the first place, and into culture and identity, right? When that phase kind of simmered out, you have the second generation of the Frankfurt School. And the father of that was Herbert Marcuse, who was an actually insane, radical, totalitarian dude. Everything that Herbert Marcuse writes is wrong. And that's obviously my analysis, but that's the analysis of actually most classical liberals. And so to understand who Herbert Marcuse was and where we are at in terms of critical theory, right? The purpose of critical theory is to transcend, not to understand anything. Critical does not have anything to do with reflection. It has everything to do with dismantling. So Herbert Marcuse was the extremist at that point. He was the guru of the 1960s. He was the strong arm for the liberation movement in the mid-20th century, and he decided to write an essay which would prove as the most calculating attack ever written on the freedom of speech and expression. And Herbert Marcuse is basically the shining jewel of today's political logic. Okay, I mentioned in the beginning that what the Frankfurt School was collectively was an intellectual mass-scale response mechanism to that identity crisis, right? Germany suffered another identity crisis. It's called World War II, right? The Holocaust was German. The Third Reich was German. This is what sparked people like Marcuse. So there was the idea, first of all, that we need to disrupt and dismantle Western civilization because it was Western civilization, quote unquote, that caused the economic downfall and the atrocities of the First World War. And we need some way to redeem ourselves. And the only way to do that is to subvert the Western ethic. And then World War II happened, and it ended in 1945. It's not a coincidence that very shortly after 1945, the influence of Marcuse skyrocketed. And we're going to be discussing just about now about why he was insane. And there's another radical left trope that suggests that political correctness doesn't come from the Frankfurt School, and that if you suggest that it does come from the Frankfurt School, you're just an alt-right nationalist. And no, I'm sorry, political correctness, speech suppression, speech codes all come from the Frankfurt School, specifically Herbert Marcuse. This is so much the fact. There is no possible way to deny this. So Herbert Marcuse was the strong arm. You hear about the Black Panthers, you hear about the Black Guerrilla family, you hear about all the murders of the 1960s and all the revolts. That was all Marcuse. Literally, all of it. And you might be thinking, well, that's hard to believe. It's like, no. The logic of all of that violence, the logic of today's political campus environment is the logic of an essay called Repressive Tolerance. And repressive tolerance is the gospel of the New Left. The idea that all this insane trash doesn't come from the Frankfurt School is an utter calculating lie. So I'm going to go over really quickly about some things, and this essay is the most famous essay in terms of Frankfurt School movements. The most famous is probably traditional theory, because that's obviously where critical theory is defined as not traditional theory, but something that is obviously dichotomous to traditional theory. It's explicitly not science, explicitly therefore isn't reason, and we're going to talk about postmodernism in a second. But when I say that when I say the Marcusean left, right? And perhaps people have heard me say that. That's actually the scholastic term. I'm not talking about liberals. I'm talking about today's radical political logic. I am talking about what is called the New Left. And I would hope that some people have heard the term New Left. The New Left is the Marcusean left. It is the left that was molded by Herbert Marcuse. And it's not a coincidence either that Herbert Marcuse's one of his students was a person named Angela Davis. Angela Davis was an actual murderer. She was a Gulag and Jim Jones apologist, and she was a Stalinist-Leninist sympathizer. She is literally insane, and she right now takes breath as we speak and has not apologized for any of it. She is still, as of us speaking right now, she is still a self-admitted communist. Her professor was Herbert Marcuse in the 60s. So we have World War II, which ended in 1945, and that caused another giant blow to the German identity, right? It caused another crisis. So this sparked this, and the Treaty of Versailles also, by the way, caused World War II, I must mention. Because when you decide to destroy German identity, there's going to be someone's going to need some type of savior. Someone's going to need some type of redeemer. His name was Hitler. His name was Adolf Hitler. And very quickly, I'll mention that Hitler became in power in 1933, okay, which was 10 years after he published Mein Kampf. So the idea that only bad people followed Hitler, only insane people followed Hitler, they had 10 years. Everybody knew who Hitler was for 10 years. Everybody knew who he was. He wrote Mein Kampf in his prison sentence. Everybody knew who Hitler was for over a decade. And it doesn't matter how intelligent you were. It doesn't matter how good you were. If you were German, you were most likely going to follow in the steps of Hitler, because the identity crisis was so monumental. It was existentially suffering. It was existential in the amount of suffering that it caused on the German people. They needed someone to take the reins of the German identity, right? And obviously nothing about what Hitler did was even close to being excusable. But you should not blame anybody at the time of that German identity crisis for following a person like Hitler. Okay? The second blow to the German identity crisis was obviously the utter failure of Germany in World War II. And so you needed people, and the Frankfurt School was the linear relationship I was talking about, of the radicalness of the Frankfurt School. There's a linear relationship with that and the identity crisis of Germany. The peak of German suffering was at the end of World War II. That's when Marcuse was born, essentially, his ideas and his logic. And Marcuse was the father of the New Left. And it's funny because even you can go on Wikipedia, and the father of the New Left is Herbert Marcuse. He was the guru. He was essentially the guru of the entire New Left. And so we're going to be talking about liberal tolerance really quick. Liberal tolerance, according to Marcuse, is in fact repressive. Liberal tolerance is the idea that we should tolerate all ideas if they're in the realm of open discourse, right? Liberal tolerance, according to Marcuse, is in fact repressive because it does not serve the ultimate Marxist vision for liberation. The thesis that's put forward by repressive tolerance, and again, that's the second gospel of the Frankfurt School, you could call it. It is the most influential text of the Frankfurt School apart from the 1937 piece. Essentially, there are some debate about that, but that's where it's at in terms of being influential. Repressive tolerance is utter intolerance towards right-leaning approaches to politics and unconditional tolerance towards left-leaning approaches to politics. Marcuse believed this because it pertains to any right-leaning thinking to maintain the status quo. So if you're not on the radical left, right? So if you're just a few microns left of actually Lenin and Stalin and Marx, if you're just a little micron right of them, you are too far right, according to Marcuse. You are too far right. And you must understand that in the 60s, that's what that meant. If you were not, in the 60s, you were a right-winger if you were not a Marxist-Leninist apologist. So in the very first paragraph of his essay, he makes it clear that he has reached a conclusion about what tolerance ought to consist of. And what I'm doing right now is mapping out political correctness and the logic of today's political ethos. And this is the logic of today's political ethos. The idea that it doesn't come from the Frankfurt School, despite the fact that Herbert Marcuse was the father of the second generation of the Frankfurt School. He was the father. Is the idea that it didn't come from all that. All this trash that we see today isn't part of the Frankfurt School, is an utter calculating lie. I'm about to prove it right here. In the very first paragraph of his essay, he makes it clear that he has reached a conclusion about what tolerance ought to consist of. And I quote, The conclusion reached is that the realization of the objective of tolerance would call for intolerance towards prevailing policies, attitudes, and opinions, and the extension of tolerance to policies, attitudes, and opinions which are outlawed or suppressed. Tolerance, for Marcuse, is something that is necessarily asymmetric. You will come to see why then asymmetric tolerance leads to the wholesale rejection of liberal freedoms. What cannot be tolerated and what must be suppressed is anything and everything at odds with the ultimate Marxist vision of liberation, or in other words, anything right of the Marxist-Leninist worldview. Marcuse writes, and I quote, "Tolerance is extended to policies, conditions, and modes of behavior which should not be tolerated because they are impeding, if not destroying, the chances of creating an existence without fear and misery." Creating an existence without fear and misery? Okay, it's unbelievably ridiculous that a grown individual who has a PhD would suggest that you can make a reality without fear and misery. No, but if your thoughts, and he specifically says thoughts, behaviors, and of thinking, do not aim in that direction of that type of liberation. Your thoughts, really, to the point of consciousness, has to be suppressed. Totalitarian asymmetrical tolerance to effect a critical revolution is the total sum of what this essay argues. If there is anything that prevents the chances of creating an existence without freedom and misery, even at the level of words and thought, it must be suppressed. Here's where it gets even crazier, and I quote, this is Herbert Marcuse speaking. "Liberating tolerance then would mean intolerance against movements from the right and toleration of movements from the left. As to the scope of this tolerance and intolerance, it would extend to the stage of action as well as of discussion and propaganda, and indeed as well as in word. So, to the point of actual consciousness, you would have to be suppressed if you are microns right of Lenin and Stalin and Marx. So if you're microns right of radical leftism, you have to be suppressed. Now, you must remember that in the 60s, you are a right-winger if you are not professing Marxist-Leninist energies. And this, the aim of Marcuse's repressive tolerance is totalitarian by design. So Marcuse explicitly calls for a double standard by demanding a leftist approach to reality whilst repressing a conservative one in all forms, even at the level of thought and behavior. He says so himself, and I quote, "To extend this to action as well as in discussion and propaganda, and indeed to words." So the idea that he wants everything suppressed that isn't radical leftism is the idea that if you're a conservative, by any stretch of the imagination, even a little bit, it means that what you're trying to do is preserve the status quo. This is, as I've explained, I think before, probably in previous lectures, is because anything with the slightest conservative overtone, by definition, seeks to preserve tradition. And Marcuse called this maintaining the status quo. Marxists in general call this the problem of reproduction, right? Marcuse explains that free speech and toleration are illusions so long as society has yet to conform to the Marxian ideal, and that we must begin by stopping, and I quote, this is Marcuse speaking, "We must begin by stopping the words and images which don't feed this consciousness." Wow, and political correctness doesn't come from the Frankfurt School, does it? It is through such anti-liberal excrescence that we see the genesis of the modern political campus environment. Use the wrong word, have a political flaw in your past, fail to line up for the next good cause, and the tolerant will be the first to come after you. This censorship and this deplatforming, this so-called political correctness, all arises from the logic of this essay, from Marcuse's repressive tolerance. He is the nurturer of this ethos. He is the father of the new left. Analyze it all you want. repressive tolerance is, for all intents and purposes, a playbook for all-out warfare on anyone who disagrees with those not professing far leftism. And so Marcuse is the apex at the point where Frankfurt School is just mostly insane. And I'm going to give you several more quotes that come out of Marcuse's mouth, literally. And they involve another essay that he wrote, which is influential, called the Biological Foundations for Socialism. And what he argues for is actual eugenics. So when I say that Herbert Marcuse was insane, I'm not being facetious. He was actually insane. He believed in eugenics. He believed that we must control consciousness. And so a few other quotations in terms of his philosophy. One of the quotations is, "We must introject a new morality into man so as to make him intolerable of society." So the term introject, and this was in another unbelievably famous and influential piece that he wrote called Eros and Civilization, Eros and Civilization. And two essays which technically are part of the same piece, Eros and Civilization and Biological Foundations for Socialism. And he says explicitly, and I quote, "We must introject a new morality into man so that he becomes intolerable of society." So at the biological level is what he's talking about. And introject, the word introject is a psychiatric term. And so before I say that, Herbert Marcuse's Eros and Civilization was a piece that attempted to synthesize Freud and Marx. So the term introject is a psychiatric term that he uses, which means to pathologize. It means to introject or inject pathologies so that the result, the human consciousness, is intolerable of society. The idea that the Frankfurt School wants to destroy society is a lie, is a right-wing trope, is an alt-right nationalist idea. It's like, no, it's not. Herbert Marcuse says so himself. And to be honest with you, Georg Lukács says so himself. And Theodor Adorno says so himself. And Max Horkheimer says so himself. And Antonio Gramsci says so himself. All these people are wanting to subvert Western civilization. So we're in the part of the lecture we're at right now. We've talked about four people, and who are the big dogs of the Frankfurt School in terms of influential writings and where the political ethos, in terms of really where the political ethos is right now. And the four people begin with Horkheimer and his 1937 piece, which defines what critical means. And then we get into the two people who were unbelievably intelligent, of course, who saw that Marx just doesn't work when the domain of analysis is economic and culture. We need to shift that domain of analysis into culture and identity because they're malleable products. Culture and identity are malleable agents. They're not fixed categories like economics and class. Because they are malleable means you essentially win the game in that aspect. And then you talk about Herbert Marcuse, and I talked about the linear regression of the radical nature of the Frankfurt School, and that it was at its worst when Herbert Marcuse was taken over. And so the last thing to mention about this in terms of what has been said so far is what is the result of all this? Obviously, there is the logic of repressive tolerance that feeds the entire campus ethos, the entire radical left ethos. All roads lead back to that essay, right? And what the logic of that essay itself is obviously Frankfurt School. And so what happens because of all this? Well, you have things like critical theory, or critical race theory, critical fat studies, critical gender theory, critical legal studies, critical whiteness studies. Critical. What does critical mean? Does it mean reflective? Does it mean thinking eternally or trying to approach conclusions? No, it doesn't. Critical, if you want to make the summation, means neo-Marxism. It means that environment where the domain of analysis has been shifted into culture and identity. Anytime you hear the word critical, and this is the point of the lecture, by the way, this part of the lecture, anytime you hear the word critical, it's neo-Marxist. Critical theory is critical race theory, it's critical theory applied to race, right? It's neo-Marxism applied to race. Critical gender studies is critical theory, neo-Marxism, i.e. neo-Marxism, applied to the social implications of having gender. Critical fatness studies is critical theory, i.e. neo-Marxism, applied to the social implications of being overweight. Critical theory, by definition, means neo-Marxism, essentially. If you want to get into the actual definition, you could just go back to Horkheimer, who says that critical theory is prescriptive. It isn't traditional theory. It doesn't involve anything that we have come to conclusions with in 2,000 years of learning and analyzing and understanding. It's an entirely new species of approach to reality. It's a normative vision for society, and the point is to transcend society. Critical is anything that has the energy of transcendence. It doesn't care to understand anything because it says it doesn't want to understand anything. Marx says himself, and it begins with Immanuel Kant, but it's important where Marx says that the point is to criticize everything and to understand nothing. And he specifically says ruthless criticism of all that exists. That's a verbatim quote. And so this leaves us with a new political ethos that's been Marxified, where because the culture domain is malleable, where because the identity domain is malleable, you have a ramification of all these new things that we see in society, right? We see critical race theory, critical gender studies, critical legal theory, queer theory. It goes on and on and on. It's all the same stuff, and the roads all lead back to the Frankfurt School. And what is it now that they do? Well, anything critical suggests that the domain of analysis, whether it be race, whatever neo-Marxist victim status that you have, whatever neo-Marxist marginalized status that you have, it assumes that that status is actual property, material property, literally. And what that essentially means is that if you're talking about whiteness, for example, whiteness is a kind of bourgeois cultural property, and the purpose is to dismantle it. It's very simple, because Marx said so himself that the purpose is to abolish private property. Private property, when in the economic and class domains, is a kind of cultural substance. And if you have private property, it means that you're bourgeois. It means that you're elite. The purpose is to abolish private property. Well, the purpose is to abolish whiteness. The purpose is to abolish heteronormativity. The purpose is to abolish masculinity. The purpose is to abolish all of this stuff because they are all forms of bourgeois cultural property. So I can say it just like this. When education is at the center of Marxist analysis, the act of being literate becomes a form of cultural bourgeois property that needs to be dismantled. That's Freire, right? But if you switch the domain of analysis to race, being white becomes a form of cultural bourgeois property that needs to be dismantled, right? That's Charlotte Harris. Charlotte Harris literally wrote a book, or literally wrote a seminal, groundbreaking piece called Whiteness as Property. To shift the focal point of Marx's analysis again to fatness, being thin becomes a form of cultural bourgeois property that needs to be dismantled, right? That's Russlum. Shift the domain of analysis yet again to feminism. Being masculine becomes a form of cultural bourgeois property that needs to be dismantled. That's Judith Butler. Well, let's shift the domain of analysis again to disability. Being able-bodied becomes a form of cultural bourgeois property that needs to be dismantled. That's Adriana Art. How about to queer theory? Well, being normal becomes a form of cultural bourgeois property that needs to be dismantled. It never ends, and it never ends because identity and culture are malleable, right? This is what I mean by the Marxification of the American ethos. And you could also say critical theory's pathological ramifications. So so that's half the story right there. That's half the story. So half the story is the intellectual mass-scale response mechanism to the terrible atrocities and to the explosion of failures in early 20th century German politics. When they needed a way to redeem themselves, right? The best way to do that, and this is actually true, is to subvert and dismantle Western civilization. The second part of the story. So if you're a woke person in today's culture, I've just described half of you. If you're a woke person in today's culture, you are Marxist. That's half of you, right? The other half is postmodernism. Now, this gets interesting because, by the way, just about everything that postmodern says is false. And that is an objective reality. But that's the other half of, if you're woke, if you're authentically woke, you are Marxist and you are postmodern, right? The term you could use is neo-Marxist, or is postmodern neo-Marxist. So the second half, you could say, happened in the 60s. Again, this is the rise of Herbert Marcuse, who was literally insane and suggested that we needed to pathologize people into hating society. He actually says that. We need to inject pathologies into people so that they hate Western civilization. Again, the idea, I have to keep mentioning that the Frankfurt School's purpose wasn't to subvert Western civilization, and that if you believe that, you're a radical right-winger, you're a Whig nut. It's just so false, because the Frankfurt School fathers say themselves that the purpose of us is to transcend society. The only way to transcend society holistically is to destroy it. And that's just what normal English parlance would suggest. And you don't even need to be interpretive. You can go read their texts, and they say so themselves. I mentioned Herbert Marcuse because right now what everybody's dealing with is the political ethos of modern campuses. And the work Repressive Tolerance is the gospel of the New Left. It is the gospel of the New Left. And every leftist professor in the world who will ever live knows very much what repressive tolerance is. And repressive tolerance is a wholesale defense. It is a totalitarian document, a wholesale defense for the suppression of speech. Blanketly. Like, you don't need to interpret the document, you can go read it yourself. So that's half the story. The other half is postmodernism, which happened in the 60s. Postmodernism is another mass-scale response mechanism. But what is it to this time? Postmodernism is a mass-scale response system to the utter failures of Marxism. And I'm talking about so the failures in the sense of utter violence and catastrophe, not in the sense of philosophically failing. So in 1923, when Jörg Lukács published his History of Class Consciousness, and when Antonio Gramsci wrote his prison notebooks, they were responding basically to the philosophical substance of Marx and saying everything about Marx is not economic. We need to get it out of economics and class and shift it over to culture and identity, right? Postmodernism is actually a mass-scale response mechanism to the violent, explosive catastrophes of Marxism, and, communism and, like all that stuff, right? So, postmodernism, the best way to resurrect Marxism, or to save it, is to suggest that there's no objective reality, that there is no objective standard, that language doesn't terminate at reality, it just terminates at more language. And so what you have in terms of postmodernism is the crisis of an ultimate vision. And that, obviously, crisis was socialist man. It was the idea that we can produce a utopia, and the utopia can be produced through the means of science, and they called that scientific socialism. Obviously, it wasn't science; it was literally all trash. But to put it shortly, postmodernism is the byproduct of the left's crisis of faith. This faith was the faith in scientific socialism. So the world's intelligentsia was not only attracted to the philosophy of Marx, but actually quite literally possessed by it. And I don't blame them. I really don't blame them. For not only promised a utopia, but did so under the ever so convincing auto-deceptive guise of science. This led to a psychosocial dependence on what Marx called scientific socialism. This psychosocial dependence led to a cosmic optimism for socialism that, according to Bertrand Russell, was something only theism could justify. So Marxism was so encapsulated that it actually induced a psychodependence upon the intelligentsia, right? They couldn't let it go. They would not let it go. They couldn't let it go, no matter what, right? Marxian philosophies and approaches were so irresistibly attractive at the time because it claimed to use science, but in reality post-Hegelian social alchemy BS, to completely solve world suffering. This again led to an intellectual psychosocial dependence, a cosmic optimism for state socialism. Well, then what happened? Well, for tremendously obvious reasons, the economic models proposed by Marx failed in every place and in every possible way you can imagine. Not only this, but the fundamental predictions in the Marxist faith all turned out to be fundamentally false on all paradigms of analysis. It's funny because there's not a single thing that Marx proposed that was right. Literally everything that he ever said was wrong. And that's actually according to Marxists and non-Marxists. It isn't science if it can't stand on its prediction. And this is so immediately important in understanding how postmodernism came to be. Now, as I've said, postmodernism is the second half of the person who is authentically woke. And the overall term for an authentically woke person is neo-Marxist or postmodern neo-Marxist. So in this context, postmodernism is the mass-scale pathological response to the utter failure of Marxism. It is a faith response to the crisis of the ultimate political vision, right? It's not a coincidence that postmodern arose in the 60s, right? It's not a coincidence at all. Very much like a religion, such a response involves the wholesale rejection of reality, reason, and science. This is why the postmodern epistemology justifies using language not as a vehicle for seeking truth, but as a rhetorical weapon in the continuing battle against a continuing battle against capitalism. So you have two mass-scale response mechanisms that are trying to save Marxism from the ashes. You have the Frankfurt School, which attempted to do so. And you have the postmodern vanguard. And none of these people are unintelligent. Jacques Derrida and Lyotard and Michel Foucault, unbelievably intelligent people, right? Fatalistic nihilists, but unbelievably intelligent people. Horkheimer, Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Adorno, and Jerry Lukács and Antonio Gramsci and Herbert Marcuse, and unbelievably intelligent people. Zero-sum nihilistic fatalists, sure, but unbelievably intelligent people. This led to the genesis of the woke, which in a common parlance you can actually describe as a neo-Marxist postmodern. Sorry, keep on getting that mixed up. A postmodern neo-Marxist. So, what is critical theory? Critical theory is a tool that is used by the Frankfurt School. Critical is anything that seeks liberation and emancipation. Critical theory is anything that doesn't seek to understand anything, but to transcend everything. That's Horkheimer, 1937. So Herbert Marcuse was the last of the Frankfurt School that's important in terms of defining the new political ethos that we find ourselves in. The person who's still alive today as we speak, who is the father of the Frankfurt School right now, is Jürgen Habermas, and he kind of he left the Frankfurt School as it was understood, and kind of branched off into his own philosophies. So he's completely not important at all in terms of the Marxist ethos. So if you hear Jürgen Habermas, not important at all. The last important person in terms of what's going on is Herbert Marcuse. And he was the most radical and insane of all the theorists. The most radical and insane. So understand that the genesis of woke, of the authentic woke person, is half Marxist and half postmodern. Both terrible things, I might add. Postmodernism, the emotional universe of a postmodernist, is guilt. And it is guilt, fatalistic, zero-sum guilt, and ingratitude. There is no such thing as a happy postmodernist. They're fatalistic, nihilistic people. And they're fatalistic, nihilistic people because it's the function of their philosophy. And in terms of a Marxist, there's no such thing as a happy Marxist, because the only possible way to approach reality if you're a Marxist is through zero-sum conflict dynamics. And we've discussed last lecture about what it means to be an anti-racist. Well, the side of the anti-racist that suggests that the only way to approach reality is through zero-sum dynamics of conflict, and that if you don't have those lenses on your face, you're a racist. If you don't have those lenses on your face, you're part of the problem. And Ibram X. Kendi specifically says that in his book, that the most dangerous people in America are not the Nazis, are not the neo-Nazis. The most dangerous people in America are not the ethno-nationalists. No, the most dangerous people in America are you. Are people who believe that they shouldn't approach reality through a racial lens. And he says that. He literally says that. Like, I'm not like making this stuff up. We went over his book. He is the father of what is termed anti-racism. He is that Marxist side of the woke. So if you want to bring science into it and suggest, is anything that Ibram X. Kendi is saying correct? Let's go to the facts. Let's verify. Let's see if we can stand our predictions. There's where the postmodern comes in. The postmodernist comes in and says, those don't matter. Those don't matter at all. So you have a perfect synthesis, right? That it's almost bulletproof in a sense. They don't have to stand on the predictions, and they don't have to be falsified because they're postmodernists. And the way they look at through reality is a zero-sum conflict lens of power dynamics. And that's inherent in anything Marxist. Marxist, by definition, is a master-slave dialectic. And when you apply this to something as malleable in culture, when you apply this to something as malleable as culture and identity, what you have is a zero-sum Hobbesian battleground of identity politics, of identity categories, of marginalized statuses. So what you would be getting out of this lecture is two things specifically. Neo-Marxism. And what's neo-Marxism? Neo-Marxism is critical theory. What's critical theory? Critical theory is neo-Marxism. Critical theory is everything that is when you shift the domain of analysis away from the economic and class. It's still Marxism. Don't let anybody in the universe ever tell you that CRT isn't Marxist. It's Marxist because it's critical theory applied to race. And Kimberly Crenshaw actually explicitly says that. And she's one of the godmothers of critical race theory, along with Derek Bell and Gene Stefanik and Rich Delgado. They all say, in 1989 when critical theory was founded, they say that we're a bunch of Marxists and we're meeting here in Madison, Wisconsin to discuss about relationships and race. Don't let anybody tell you that queer theory isn't Marxist. It's Marxist because Judith Butler and Gail Rubin say it's Marxist. Judith Butler and Gail Rubin are the fairy godmothers of queer theory, right? They're the scholars of queer theory. But it's also postmodern because by design, it doesn't have to stand on its predictions. It doesn't have to be falsifiable. And that pertains to the substance is non-falsifiability, right? Because science is just is a heteronormative, androcentric, patriarchal ideology, right? It's a white, androcentric, patriarchal, cis heteronormative ideology. Reason also is anything that involves the Enlightenment, that involves, maybe there's an objective reality. That's a white ideology. And so yes, those are the two things, neo-Marxist and postmodernism. Both of them are mass-scale, pathological, I might add, response mechanisms to the utter failures of a political vision, of the ultimate political vision. So the history of the Frankfurt School begins with the German identity being completely assaulted. And the history of the Frankfurt School leads more into the identity of Germany being assaulted at the end of World War II. And so that fed the process of the radicalization. And we talked about Paul Fidetti last time. He's another member of technically a member of the Frankfurt School. Not explicitly, but everything that he preaches is Frankfurt School methodology. But Herbert Marcuse is the apex of the radicalized Frankfurt School methodology. It begins with Horkheimer, it ends with Marcuse. Okay? Between Horkheimer and Marcuse, you have a crap ton of other theorists, each individual being unbelievably intelligent, very well read, not trivial people, right? But the big giants we've discussed is beginning with Horkheimer, and then Antonio Gramsci and Gary Lukács. They're the two people that shifted that domain of analysis. They did the thing. If you're a Marxist, that's the thing you should do, because Marxism doesn't work economically, and you can go to any university on the planet. If you go to the economy department, the economist department, you'll never see a Marxist ever. It's just not a thing anymore. But if you go to the humanities, you will. If you go to the social sciences department, you will. They're all Marxists. They're all Marxists. It's been Marxified because those are malleable categories. They're not fixed. So, and the other half of that is the postmodern half, another mass-scale response mechanism to the utter failures of a socialist absolute vision. And it's not a coincidence that Marxism and postmodernism fit so well like a glove. And you hear about, oh no, but postmodernists, they heavily critique Marxism. Sure they do, but it's along a dialectical trajectory. So it means that the critique is part of the substance. And so that's a little trick that they like to play. It's like, no, postmodernists are also Marxists by design. And so yeah, if you are in woke culture, which is most likely where you're at, if you're in the United States, you are in a culture that is postmodern neo-Marxist, and that's really the end of the story there. And I can get into detail. I'm not going to get into detail, but I can get into detail of the philosophies behind these titans, behind Gary Lukács and Antonio Gramsci, behind Horkheimer and Adorno, which were kind of the two fathers to begin with, because it will all make sense. But I mentioned Herbert Marcuse because instead of getting into philosophy of technically critical theory, because Herbert Marcuse's Repressive Tolerance is the most influential document ever written in terms of what we see in terms of what you see on campuses, which is speech suppression, deplatforming, safe spaces, words like inclusion. And inclusion we have discussed as they've hijacked the linguistic territory to the point where words don't mean what they mean. And inclusion is a really good fun word, because inclusion, by definition, means speech suppression, because it means that you're producing a social space in which you can't be offended. That's what inclusion seeks to do. Inclusion considers your marginalized status as a status that is not able to be offended, and if you offend it, it's not an inclusive space. The problem with that, as we have discussed, is that if you are speaking to people, you cannot speak without being offensive. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what you could possibly ever say or fathom. You cannot speak without being offensive. You can speak to two people. Sure, you can try it. Try not to be offensive if you're speaking to two people. Yeah, maybe you can do it. I'm pretty sure most people can do it. If you're speaking to 5 people, yeah, you might be able to still do it, right? What happens if you're speaking to 10 people, 20 people, 50, 60, 80, 1,000, 4,000? It doesn't matter who you are. And it doesn't matter what you could ever possibly say or think, you will offend people. You will offend someone. Out of 100 people, I think statistically speaking, out of 100 people, you'll offend 20. And there is no way around that. But inclusion suggests that we need to produce a social space in which that is not possible, in which you can't be offended. And the only way to do that is speech codes. The only way to do that is speech suppression. That's Herbert Marcuse right there. So most people don't know this, but the logic that we live in today is the logic of that essay, is the logic of repressive tolerance. And that's why I had to mention it. You don't have to get into the philosophies of Horkheimer or Adorno or Walter Benjamin or any of the critical theorists. You don't have to get into that, right? That's all. It's important, but it's not as important, and it's not as visual, and it's not as visceral as things like repressive tolerance or things like the 1937 essay, Traditional and Critical Theory by Horkheimer. And so, ending this here lecture, you will, because the series that we're on right now is about mastering the linguistic territory, understanding what the words mean. Critical does not mean critical thinking. That's not what it means. It doesn't mean reflective. Critical, according to Horkheimer, means transcendence, right? And it means transcendence, and it means anything that seeks liberation. Liberation from what? Liberation from, obviously, Western culture, white culture. There are some really fun quotes by Gary Lukács as well, and Antonio Gramsci, that are so explicitly anti-Western and anti-culture, it's actually pretty funny. But I ended with Marcuse. And so that's the half side of the woke. The half of a woke person is Marxist all the way through. The other half is postmodern. We don't need to get into the philosophy of postmodernism either, because it's also very complicated. And most of it's just utter trash and cryptic prose jargon, to be honest with you. But people like Judith Butler and Gail Rubin, who are the fairy godmothers of queer theory and fairy godmothers of the gender ideology, it's postmodernism. It's suggesting that gender, for example, is an active performance. It doesn't have any tether towards biological strata or realities. It is something that you perform, and it is socially normalized into your being. Right? It's postmodernism because it suggests that objective reality is not necessary for explaining circumstances. So understand when I end this that that's the best way to characterize an authentic woke person is a postmodern neo-Marxist. And remember, please, that it is not a conspiracy theory that the Frankfurt School, all roads lead back to the Frankfurt School. The purpose of the Frankfurt School was to disrupt and dismantle Western civilization. And that was their purpose because that's what they said their purpose was. You don't have to make things up. You can go read their texts. And so without getting into too much detail, that's what we went down without too much detail in terms of postmodernism. That's what went down. There are two mass-scale pathological response mechanisms to the utter failures of an ultimate vision. Obviously, that was socialist man. Obviously, that was communism, whatever you want to call it. Radical leftism is a good way to just sum it all up. They were the full-scale or mass-scale pathological response mechanisms to the utter failures of radical left politics of the early and mid 20th century. But the Frankfurt School has even a more rich history actually than postmodernism. Postmodernism just literally started in the 60s, and it started technically in the art movement. We don't need to get into that, but postmodernism is a mass-scale response mechanism to the utter failures of Stalinism, to the utter failures of communism, and to the other failures of radical left politics. And I said that because what I said before was also that Marxism actually did literally produce a psychosocial dependence. So it doesn't matter how intelligent you were, doesn't matter how read you were probably going to be a Marxist. It was a very, very attractive, deceptive system. And as I've said, it was so because what Marxism is metaphysics dressed up in economic disguise, right? But it isn't at all economic, and it's not social. And yes, so that's really where we're at. Are there any questions in terms of what postmodernism is, or what critical is, or what the Frankfurt School was or is? Any questions at all?
I have a question. I guess why do you, this is Jessica, by the way. Sorry, I didn't say that last week, and I didn't know I was supposed to say that, but I'm new to this whole thing. I'm just trying to figure it all out. But why do you think these ideas keep coming to the surface if they haven't been successful historically?
Okay, that's a very good question. One of the reasons is, and as I've mentioned, what they have done is they have hijacked the linguistic territory, and what that means in a Saussurean sense, in an actual sense, is that they have hijacked the means by which people think. So words are simultaneous thought. When you speak, you are simultaneously thinking, and that is the actual fundamental case. So if you hijack the linguistic territory, what you do is you hijack by the means by which people think, right? That's number one. That's the first reason why it's so successful and why people aren't just dropping it, looking at history and stuff like that. The second reason why this trash is so popular and not easily able to be rid of is because of that paradigm shift. So when you shift the domain of analysis away from economics and class, which is science, right? So economics is mathematics, by the way. If you're an economist, you're a mathematician. When you shift the domain of analysis away from objective reality and into something like culture and identity, which is what happened in 1923, you have a system that doesn't need to stand on its predictions. You have a system that doesn't need to confront objective reality. You have a system that doesn't need to be predicated on the laws of reason and the laws of correspondence and the laws of validity, right? That's the second half as to why society can't shake off this cancerous tumor, you could say. It's good to understand that. It's good to understand why people can't take this. The series that we're on right now is the third series, and each series has 10 lectures. This series is about mastering the linguistic territory, because if you master the linguistic territory, you truly master the means by which you are able to think about what's going on. And it's not possible to master the means by which you think in terms of this Marxified ethos if you don't understand the language game they're playing. And the language game they're playing is they take words from the English dictionary that sound really pretty. And it started with words like class consciousness, which was way back in the 1800s. Class consciousness is not, it sounds economic, doesn't it? It's not. Class consciousness, the concept of class consciousness is deeply deeply religious and it's crackpot. It is Gnostic. Class consciousness is the idea that you can have special insight into reality. And this special insight isn't arrived at through epistemological defaults. You don't arrive at this special insight into reality through reason or logical deduction, right? So they have hijacked linguistic territory, and it technically began with Marx. They hijack words like inclusion. The word inclusion sounds pretty. It's not pretty at all. Inclusion is actually evil. It means speech suppression by definition, and that's according to them, not me. So that's the scary part as well. They hijack words like diversity. Diversity doesn't mean what diversity means at all. It doesn't, and they say so themselves. They hijack words like equity. Equity sounds pretty, doesn't it? Nope, it's not. Equity is literally rebaggaged to neo-socialism. Equity is literally communism, and they say so themselves. So, in diversity, by the way, diversity doesn't mean having a bunch of different worldviews, having a bunch of different marginalized people, right? Diversity means having the identical neo-Marxist critical worldview, right? So you're only diverse if you're expressing the voice of your marginalized neo-Marxist status. So if you're a woman, for example, if you're not speaking your marginalized status, your voice is not authentic. Your voice is not what they call diverse. So yeah, sure, diversity looks like bringing all these people who have different skin colors and have different backgrounds and have different histories, right? Sure, that's the first part, right? No, but guess what? You can do all that if they don't have the same zero-sum power dynamic neo-Marxist worldview. If they don't speak the voice of their marginalized status, they're not diverse. So it's very tricky. Things like this. So mastering what these words means mastering the means by which you're able to approach it. And so answering the question, why does this stuff linger? Why can't people just move on from it? Why can't they shake it off? The answer to that is twofold. It's because the linguistic territory has actually been hijacked. And that's, I think, all in all, is the most effective reason. I'm not sure if that really answers your question, but if it does, let me know.
I'd like to make a comment, and I don't know if there is others on this forum that have noticed this, but I've seen it repeatedly on my internet, the network. They're now advertising that if this is funny, okay? If your pantry and kitchen is neat and tidy, it is an example of white supremacy. And you have to, and you've got to have these messy pantries and kitchens as part of this woke culture. And to me, when I see that, I just crack up laughing. I'm like, how low can you get? How stupid can you get? That's ridiculous, but they actually are circulating.
Well, so I'd like to comment about that, actually. So the Smithsonian recently published a infographic about what qualifies as white culture. And the infographic is called White Culture in the United States, right? So what they have suggested that is that reasoning, self-sufficiency, punctuality, nuclear family, these are the actual terms, by the way, that are on there, are products of white culture, right? So if you're not, what they're saying is that black people, for example, are not reason-oriented, are not able to arrive on time to work, because that's just white culture. That's white supremacy culture. And they were forced to apologize. The Smithsonian was forced to apologize for that because what they said essentially was liberalism suggests that those qualities belong to humanity. Okay? They don't belong to white people. Being punctual is something that we can all be capable of.
Okay.
Being cause and effect oriented is something we can all be. No, that's all white supremacy culture, according to neo-Marxism. So.
Okay, I'd like to give a little background on that because I followed it very, very carefully. In this African American museum, they actually had a display, very big and prominent at the entrance, saying the same thing, that these are, if you have a job, continuous job.
The Smithsonian owned that. The Smithsonian owned that museum.
So what happened is that at that time Trump was in power in administration. And I think it's absolutely ridiculous that the president's administration had to get involved with this. But Eric Trump, he's the one who noticed it, or he saw it as brought to his attention, and it became a congressional issue. It was brought up. And I don't know if there was a hearing. I don't think there was, but he made such a big fuss about it. That thing was removed. The director who was at that time, in office was fired. And now we're hearing about the apology that came. It was the most ridiculous display that ever any American organization would have put up. And I'm very proud, because for me, the self-correcting phenomena of America is a very big thing. And I'm very proud of whoever it was who took that down, because race has got nothing to do with hard work. We all know that. And there are people in all countries who work, no matter what the color of the skin or whatever the race. They're very hardworking people. So that is the total rubbish, and it's totally that Marxist thing that you're talking about. So I wanted to mention to you the background.
Okay, yes, very true.
So I had a follow-up to my other question of just, I guess, when we think about us, those of us that are working with Moms for Liberty, and specifically in the schools, the public schools, and just it seems like, as you said, like a mass scale response mechanism, and that just seems so overwhelming. And so, going back to the 30s, or even beyond before that, and just this machine that's kind of been in place and working for just so many decades, and just thinking about us coming in and trying to fight this, it feels very overwhelming. Just any advice on what we should do with this information that we have? We have this knowledge. What do we do with it? How do we educate others? What hope is there for our public school system? I know that's kind of a loaded question, but just any thoughts there?
Could you ask the question in a different way? Because I'm confused. You kind of cut up a little bit.
Oh, I'm sorry. Just the thinking about between the postmodernism, the neo-Marxism, the woke, all of those things, and just how you were describing it with the mass scale response mechanism, and how that just feels super overwhelming when we are, fighting these things in the public school system. I guess, do you have any advice on kind of what we do with this information? I guess is kind of how do we fight the system? How do we fight, or how do we I don't know what the word might be. Just how do we debunk maybe Does that make
Yep.
more
There are. I'm not sure how long have you been with us here, if I may ask.
how many sessions have I listened to? Is that what you're saying? This is my second.
Okay. So you have not, you were not there for the first and second series. And this is important to understand. The first series was about the intellectual substrate, the intellectual ideas behind all this. It was basically describing the Frankfurt School in more detail. And, well, I'll just say this. We're on the third series, which is about how to fight back. The third series is about how to fight back. And there are two ways to do it. And the first way is to master the linguistic territory, because there's no way you can fight back if you don't understand the means by which the process of thinking happens. And mastering, simple words like equity and inclusion and diversity and authenticity and all these pretty sounding words, if you understand what they actually mean, that's the first step. Because then if you're, for example, if you're representing a policy board, you won't be oblivious as to what's going on or what people are putting into policy, right? Because if you haven't mastered the terms equity, inclusion, and diversity, and you're at a policy board meeting of some sort, they're going to be putting that trash into policy, and you would not have done anything about it because those words sound pretty. Those words sound fantastic. Now, there's about 40 more words. And if you're not familiar with these words, if you've not mastered these words, you're going to be that person in policy boards, as an example, sitting at the policy board, and all that stuff's going to be instantiated into policy and thus the lives of people. That's the first way to fight back, and that's the first thing that you should do. The second thing is to know your enemy, which means understanding the scholars themselves, the people who are responsible for all this. Understand who they are and what they say. So an example of that is there's this idea that critical race theory isn't Marxist. Or how about critical race theory doesn't suggest that all white people are racist? And the answer to that is yes, it does, because they say so. And you're bulletproof at that point, because if they want to argue back on you, they have to do so on their own terms. It is a process of self-annihilation if they want to argue back at you. Kimberly Crenshaw says that all white people are racist. Richard Delgado and Gene Stefanchik say all white people are racist, like explicitly. Like those are the words they use. Robin DiAngelo, and I could quote if I wanted to, page 149 of White Fragility. She says that there's no such thing as a white positive identity. All white identity is inherently racist. So don't tell me that critical race theory doesn't say all white people are racist. The most prominent acolytes of critical race theory say all white people are racist. It's what they say. And there's no way to fight that back. There's no way you can fight that back because it would be a process of self-annihilation. These people are the most eminent scholars in the world in terms of what's called critical social justice, which is the scholastic engine that perpetuates all this trash into the universities. So Kimberly Crenshaw is just an example. Richard Delgado and Gene Stefanchik and Robin DiAngelo. These guys are at the forefront of what's called critical social justice ideology. You go to these people if you want to understand any of this woke trash, right? And this is what they are saying. So, and the idea that all white people are racist, that's just an example I'm just giving. And it is a fact that one of the fundamental tenets of critical race theory are that all white people are racist. That there is the original sin of whiteness, and the purpose of an anti-racist is to become cleansed of whiteness. the original sin of whiteness. Ibram X. Kendi makes this very explicit, that becoming an anti-racist or being an anti-racist means emancipation from your inherent complicity in white supremacy. Emancipation, a Judeo-Christian cleansing process of your sin of whiteness, right? So it's puritanical garbage, but this is what they say. So that's the second method of fighting back, is know your enemy. And that's actually what the fourth and last series is about, is we're going to know our enemy. So this series we're in right now, which is the third series, Mastering Linguistic Territory, and we've gone over words like diversity, equity, inclusion. We've gone over words like anti-racism. We just today gone over words, the important word today was critical. The term critical just means neo-Marxist. So you'll see things like critical discourse studies. You'll see things like critical media studies, right? There's all these new things coming out. Critical media studies, critical legal studies, right? And then you have things like critical race theory and critical gender studies and critical whiteness studies and critical pedagogy, right? If you're at a policy board, you're sitting with policymakers and stuff like that, and they decide to put forth something into policy, and policy by definition affects other people's lives, and it has the word critical in front of it, you already know that your Marxist radar is crimson red, right? Because critical means neo-Marxist by definition. Critical means critical theory applied to whatever domain of analysis that's being affected, whether it be media studies or whiteness or fatness or disability, right? There's critical disability studies. We've talked about that previously. You'll understand that what's being pushed into policy is something that's neo-Marxist. And because, obviously because neo-Marxism is a special kind of worldview, you can't put it into policy because that means imposing someone else's special kind of worldview, right? If policy is going to be imposed, it must be imposed on an objective standard, because objectivity applies to everybody, right? Those are just basics. But yes, your question was, how do we move forward, or what do we do about it? And the answer are the two things that I am providing. The very first series is the history of the neo-Marxist, of the Marxified process of the ethos, the historical process of Marxification. That was the first series, and honestly, it was the most complicated because it did get into some of critical theory and things like that. But where we're at right now is what to do about it. Your question, what to do about it. That's where we're at right now. And the first thing to do about it is to master linguistic territory. And that's where we're at right now. So I hope that answers your question. If you have any more questions, you let me know.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
I'd like to add an experience that I had just recently on this exact same thing that you're saying, a method, because there are people who don't understand what woke is. And
yes, that is very true.
Yes. And so the ones who are on this group, I actually asked Madrushka to give me a paragraph so that I could just have it. It's convenient, it's right there, and I would just forward it to them.
Yes. I can tell you quickly actually what it is.
No, but I want to tell you the reaction. This educated fellow that I was discussing with, when he read your description, I think he didn't understand it. He denied it completely. So,
oh sure, yeah.
If you explain to them what woke is and where it comes from, it's not 100% that they're going to accept it, and we have to be ready. So the way I don't like to get into unnecessary arguments, so I said, fine, if you don't believe it, just go ahead and do your own research. And my guess is that you will come to the same conclusion, but here you have what an expert is giving you. If you don't believe the expert, you do the American thing, go and learn yourself. Well, I didn't tell him about the American thing because he's not American. But I said, go ahead and just one short sentence. I said, go ahead and just learn for yourself, and that was the way I'm handling it. However, just using their terms and their words is a very good method. However, I just want to, alert from my experience that if they're not ready for absorbing and learning, or if they're in cognitive dissonance, or if they cannot, they're in denial, or they'll get fired if they accept, then it's not 100% that they're going to, go along with the correct. That's what I wanted to say. What
that situation was missing, though, Narveen. Oh, and also I'm also not American, so not like how that really matters. But what that situation was missing actually was open dialogue, and open dialogue is toxic for this kind of stuff, because open dialogue is actually a form of cross-examination, and when you send my approximation of what woke is, which is an expert approximation, there is no existing counter argument, you could say, for my approximation for woke. And it's actually not my approximation. There was no open dialogue. And that's the problem, is if there's no open dialogue, there's no imposition to think. Because what they just see are words. They don't see an interaction. And that's what open dialogue does. Open dialogue, by its nature, enforces and imposes a reciprocating interaction. And that is very toxic for this trash. Yeah. But keep sending away, There's always people who are there to cling, and they'll cling on to it.
So I have something I want to share with you. Let me get it out here. I had it. This is from Thomas.
I must ask you, are there any more questions?
No, but can I just share this before anybody asks a question, because otherwise I might forget. Because of the last comment that you made, that study away and we'll make some progress. This is exactly what Thomas Jefferson said. And this is his quote that I discovered just yesterday, and I have it on my desk. And it says, "The ground of liberty is to be gained by inches. We must be contented to secure what we can get from time to time and eternally press forward for what is yet to get." I love it.
Yes. Well, what he was saying there actually was the first fundamental. What he was just saying right there was actually one of the first fundamental hallmarks of liberalism, which is incrementalism. What? Incrementalism as opposed to revolution, right? Because these Marxists want revolution.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
At that point. Yeah.
Are there any other questions about the word that must be solidified into your conscience? The word critical, or perhaps any word like postmodernism or neo-Marxism or anything like that? Any questions? Alrighty. Well, Naveen, is that everything you have?
Sorry, I had muted myself out. I don't have anything. My mind is constantly, because of the way my mind works, is looking for solutions on how to get through to people. And we have one logistic problem is the attention span of readers, of people. And some of the longer texts, like you read, and a lot of people do read books, but the majority do not. And it's like, I've mentioned this word before to you, Andrushka, in our discussions. I've called it Twitterization of people, because the Twitter only allows 140 words. That's the attention span. It's gone down so so low. So we have to give them little bits of information, and I'm thinking of the methods to get your information across. You know, it's ridiculous that half the country is woke and people don't know what woke means. And it's now not only in America, I'm hearing it in other countries. So the word is spreading and they don't know what it means. And so it's absolutely ridiculous. And the Merriam-Webster dictionary has given a nasty meaning for the word woke, and I don't know if you can fix it. Like with Wikipedia, they might allow you to fix it, but with Merriam, I don't know if they're going to allow it. We may have to write to them. But their definition of woke is that it is a slang word used by the right as a negative connotation or something like that. It's a very biased explanation. We have to look it up and see if we can tell them that that's not what it, that it's not something that is a fault of the right or the conservatives. So that's an issue. That is a very big issue. How do we get across when we're educating people? How do we get through to them when you have the majority of people not willing to read or unable to read? That's one.
Well, as I said, it's open dialogue. Open dialogue is the way to do it. And open dialogue is so unbelievably toxic for the woke. And that's one of the ways forward is open dialogue. So but the open dialogue would consist of you mastering. The open dialogue would consist of you mastering the linguistic territory that they've hijacked, and it would involve knowing your enemies. And if you do those two things, open dialogue will be toxic and venomous each and every single time.
Well, one way of open dialogue is the all-American method. From the beginning of when America was made, is town hall meetings. Because with a town hall, and I've been to a town hall through this integrative holistic healing, and they had a town hall with the NIH had come into Minnesota, and they were going to all different states because Bill Clinton, right before he left, had authorized a white paper to investigate what at that time it was called alternative medicine. This is, when he left office. And then as a consequence of that, the NIH had gone to all the various states and they had town hall meetings, and I attended one of them. It was very effective because it's advertised to the people, and it's done officially through and we can do it because of the schools. The schools are under the county commissioner, and so we could possibly do it through that. I don't know. I'm just, my mind is going around how to get, I've been doing this for a couple of your sessions, and it's the same thing again. How do we get through to people?
Hello? Can you hear me? I got cut off, sorry.
No, I was like, am I talking in an echo chamber because there was nothing? For a while was nothing. All right. Well, the town hall is actually one way, and I'm discussing it over here with a couple of people, and who are interested in getting on the school board. And so we're looking at this option, but that may be a practical way of getting through to people and educating them, because the public has to know. Even if there's a debate, the public has to know.
Absolutely. Yes. Very true.
Okay, that's all I have. Should we then End the session till next week. Are we going to continue next week?
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
All right then, and then we'll send the e-flyer out for next week, and then this recording will be uploaded in a couple of days. All right then. Good night, everyone. Should I end the recording?